So I'd like to thank you all for coming out today, and I'd especially like to thank our esteemed panel. And I'll just go through some introductions now. So in the center here we have Ron Kaplan, recently a vice president at Amazon and the chief scientist of Amazon Search Technologies. Previously, he was founder and director of the Natural Language and Artificial Intelligence Lab at Nuance Communications. Before Nuance, he managed the semantic initiatives and natural language platform teams for the Bing search engine. He also served as chief technology officer and chief scientific officer at PowerSet, a deep semantic search company acquired by Microsoft. PowerSet was a PARC spin-out based on technology developed by his group here at PARC. Cathy Pearl here to my left is the VP of User Experience at Sensley, whose virtual nurse avatar, Molly, helps people engage with their health. Cathy is the author of the O'Reilly book, Designing Voice User Interfaces. She has worked on everything from helicopter pilot simulators at NASA to a conversational iPad app in which Esquire magazine's style columnist tells you what you should wear on a first date. During her time at Nuance and Microsoft, Cathy designed voice user interfaces for banks, airlines, and Ford Sync. Abby Jones at the far end leads teams answering critical business questions through design, prototyping, and testing ideas with customers. In her role at Area 120, she focuses on experimental products. Previously, she was a design lead for the security and privacy team, Google Fiber, and Google Search. Prior to joining Google in 2011, Abby designed social systems for MySpace, campaigns and sales systems for StubHub and Ferrari, and online leadership and safety tools for the Mine Safety and Health Administration. So join me in welcoming the panel here. And I'm Kyle Dent. I'm a research manager here at PARC. I manage the Conversational Human Agent Technology Group, and we focus on dialogue systems and conversational technologies. So I'll get things started, setting a little context and teeing up some of the ideas we want to cover. Then you'll hear from each of the panelists, and then we'll move into a more open discussion. And at the end, we should have time for questions from all of you. So when I first got started with conversational systems, it was only about 5 years ago. I used to give presentations about the work we did, and I would explain to people that people are talking to computers more and more. And I would include a slide of all the companies that were getting involved in voice and chat. And I did this because I felt like I had to justify my claim that this was happening more and more. And from today's perspective, looking back at just that short time, it seems crazy that I felt I had to justify it. But in a very short span of time, we went from almost nobody doing voice technologies to practically everybody doing it in some form. So the technology, in some ways the technology has arrived, in other ways really not. So we're moving into this conversational lifestyle, and one of the things we want to talk about is this idea of conversational interactions. And if we can have true conversational interactions, what does that mean? So it's useful to think about the way people talk to technology today. So sometimes it's as simple as a voice command. If I have a voice-enabled thermostat, for example, I can say, raise the temperature or lower the temperature. I'm effectively executing a command with my voice. But it's not so different from pushing a button or selecting an item from the menu. There's other types of interactions that are more open-ended, question answering, for example. If I ask a simple question, I get an answer, but there's no real back and forth. There's no interaction. If my question is not well formed or it's ambiguous, I'm not going to get any help finding the information I'm looking for. So the idea is that we have this shift in, or a progression of user interfaces. And if we're now moving into this idea of a conversational user interface as opposed to a graphical user interface, a CUI, what does that mean? What are the types of technologies that we can expect to have if we could have true conversational user interfaces? And this is the question that we want to cover. in our discussion today. And I think I'll turn to the panel now, and we'll have each of them give a brief perspective of where they are. Let's start with Ron.
Thank you. So I thought I would give a historical perspective, particularly because here we are at PARC. And I want to go back to the early 70s when I first came to PARC. And that was when the vision of personal computers and the Alto and all these things that maybe you've heard of, this legendary kind of time at PARC. And one of the questions was, how are ordinary people going to be able to interact with their personal computers? And one approach to that was the development of the windows and the mouse and overlapping windows, icons, all the things that became known as the graphical user interface. And the Alto, the original machine, was very highly optimized for interaction through the mouse and with the bitmap display and the whole thing that made those interactions very, very smooth. And part of the idea of the graphical user interface is that there were interface components that were universal across all the different applications that you might want to execute on the computer. So whether you're doing this kind of task, editing, or looking up information, or whatever it is, the interface components would be the same, would be universal. And that was very, very effective, as we all know. At the same time, again, this is in the early 70s, there was another attitude or another idea or another approach to this, which was through language, through conversation. And we didn't know to call it then. At the same time, we didn't know to call it the GUI. We didn't know to call it the CUI, which we now look back and say, well, that's what we were doing. But that was the idea of developing a dialogue system or conversational system that would allow back and forth interaction, would have high quality language interpretation or language understanding, language generation, and access to some sort of back-end service so there was actually something to talk about. And around 1977, we actually wrote a paper that was called GUS, for Genial Understander System, a frame-based system that actually brought together a lot of the technologies, the component technologies that you need to have in order to do conversation. You have to have the language interpretation. You have to have back-end reasoning of some sort. You have to have some sort of knowledge of a little bit of the world that you're talking about and so forth. So that was Danny Bobrow, who some of you may know of, or know, he recently died, unfortunately. Don Norman, who in the design community you're probably very familiar with. Martin Kay as a linguist, myself, Terry Winograd, computer science. So we brought together, we published this paper, and in a way, a lot of the ideas in that paper are the ideas that you find in the conversational systems of today. Kind of a frame-based, slot-filling kind of dialogue system with mixed initiative. That is, the user and the system could both take control of the conversation, so that it wasn't like a menu system where you can only respond to the things that the system asked you. But this is 1977. You had to type. There were no back-end services to connect to, so we faked up a little slice of the official airline guide database. So all you could do was have a dialogue about taking a trip from Palo Alto to San Diego. And you couldn't talk to it. Speech hadn't reached any level of sophistication at all. But it was still illustrated a lot of the ideas that some of which are not yet even widely deployed in the systems that we have today. So that was then. It turned out that that was a lot harder than the GUI problem. The GUI turned out to be a lot harder. So slow forward 40 years. And I would say now that all of the things that were gating items that we needed then and we didn't have are basically in place. So one of the big things is the quality of speech, automatic speech understanding. And I think maybe 5 years ago, maybe a little before that, those systems kind of made the transition from you try them when you have nothing else to do and you want to be amused, to you try and you expect them to fail and you're surprised when they succeed, to you're now surprised when they fail and you actually want to use them to do something where you want to accomplish something. So that's kind of a big obstacle that has been removed. You have all the services and all the, now, the IoT stuff, and there's something that's worth talking about. And that's something. And you also have the widespread distribution of computation that we didn't have in those days, cost-effective computation, these devices that can actually do cost-effectively all the things that you need to have done. So a lot has changed. One of the things that was also predicted at PARC or discussed at PARC about 20 years ago was the notion of ubiquitous computing, which is kind of the IoT idea. And that was kind of a prediction, and it's come to pass. There's the unintended side effect of ubiquitous computing, which is ubiquitous complexity. And that's what we all see with all the devices that we have, the thermostat. 50% of the thermostats in the United States are on hold, because once you get off hold, you're screwed. Nobody knows how to get back. So even if you're going on vacation, all of these the conversational interface and the language interface is really the universal interface that goes across domains, like the GUI, across devices. And that's what we need to kind of master the complexity, the digital complexity in the world that we've all arrived at and that we're going to be confronting from now on. So I think I'll stop there and just give that.
Abby?
All right. Let's see. I actually have a question for folks out there. Is, who here had, whose family had a desktop computer before you were 10 years old? So, all right, small number. My family got its first desktop computer when I was 7 years old. So basically grew up with a computer. So it's a natural thing for me and my brother. My own kid, he's growing up with voice devices from several companies in our house today, and so the voice interface is natural for him. But it's a little bit different from how we've considered. We're asking ourselves, is the conversational interface the replacement for the GUI? But a conversational interface is really different from a graphical user interface, because a graphical user interface has an entire set of conventions around it that are essentially all things that have been invented by human beings in the recent past, right? Like a computer hasn't actually been around for that long. Computer programs are newer. The internet is something new. And yet a spoken interface, or being able to interact via speech, is not new. It's something that we all practice doing regardless of whether or not we have a computer. We all have experience doing. And so our expectations are wildly different. And even as technology has improved drastically in the recent past, the problem is that even though we have automatic speech recognition or understanding in terms of the words that were said, we still don't have an understanding a lot of the time in terms of the meanings of those words and the subtleties that go into human speech. And so that's where we still have a lot of the slot filling. So our systems are looking for the name of a hotel or a time of day to set a reminder for. But the more subtle interactions that actually make a voice system satisfying are still missing from a lot of what we use today and the different tools that we use. And so I think that's an area where we still have some shortcomings. And then the other issues that we have, play into things like accessibility. So finally, we have an interface that can be used without looking at it, but at the same time, if we're making experiences that can only be heard, where does that leave people who may be deaf to start with, and where does that leave all of us as our hearing degenerates over time? We're all going to age. Voice interfaces have known issues with hearing aids and how they interact with them and the frequencies that they speak at. And so there are issues with accessibility there, not just for permanent disabilities, but even situational ones. And then also there are significant privacy and security issues to voice interfaces. Think about things like voice-based banking and how difficult that can be, or whether or not you want to have an interface that says everything you see on this, would otherwise see on a screen be public to everyone around you. And so there are specific uses, right? You're horrified. You're like, oh no, I see what's on my phone. Yeah. I know I sound really pessimistic about voice interfaces, but in part it's because I'm so interested in them. I find them utterly fascinating, and I want them to work for everyone. And I think we're not at a place yet where that can happen. And it's not necessarily that we've solved every security and privacy issue with graphical interfaces either, but that if we actually want a voice-based interface to work for us, we still have quite a ways to go.
Great. Cathy?
So I think the word conversational means different things to different people. I think for some people, there's so much hype, especially in the media, about conversational. You know, you're going to be talking to your fridge in your car, and it's going to be a conversation, and they'll call, you know, just asking to play a song conversational. And then there's the other extremists who say nothing is conversational until we're having human-like conversations, like in the movie Her, and that's it, no conversation till then. Personally, I view more of a middle ground where I think about conversations you have in your daily lives, maybe with someone like a customer service representative on the phone. Typically, you have a pretty scripted conversation. I mean, it's not exactly the same questions in exactly the same order, but you stay on topic usually. You know, you're talking about your bill or some other problem, and you're not talking about philosophy usually, and all those kinds of things. And to me, that's still a good conversation, can be a good conversation, even if it's a limited domain. And in a lot of ways, we can do that kind of thing with our current technology. At my company, Sensely, we have this virtual nurse avatar. And it's for people who usually have chronic health conditions, and they're having a conversation with their avatar that has a specific start and a specific end. It can go a lot of different places in the middle. But we're still calling it a conversation, even though they can't go off on all kinds of different tangents. Instead, we're talking about their blood pressure, and did they take their medication, and how are they feeling. But I still view it as a successful, engaging conversation in that limited domain. And one of the reasons we have an avatar and why we use voice and all that kind of stuff is, like Abby was saying, we speak from a very young age. We don't maybe know the formal rules of conversation. We couldn't maybe write them down, but we understand them. And so if we can adapt to that, then people don't have to have a user manual. So for us, we have a lot of older users in their 70s or 80s who are using our mobile app with our avatar. And the first thing the avatar says to them when they're in their daily check-in is, how are you? And we don't have to teach people, well, what button am I going to press now? What am I going to do now? Because the avatar says, how are you? And people just respond naturally. I'm fine, I'm tired, I'm stressed, whatever. The avatar can also give instructions. You know, please put on your blood pressure cuff now and read the blood pressure, things like that. So I think we have reached some level of conversation in some of our situations, but we're still obviously a long way out from just being able to go off on any subject. And as Kyle was saying earlier, a lot of times these systems fall down flat when you diverge slightly. Like I was using Wobot, which is a chat system that is supposed to help people with depression and anxiety. And it was asking me to reframe some anxious moment as a should. I make it from a should into a positive. And so it said, okay, tell me the should that you changed. And I said, I didn't think of one. And it said, that's great, you did a great job. You know, it was just like, I see that a lot, where it's just like you deviate slightly from your script, and that's when things really, really fall down. So I think we need to focus in the near term really on this idea of context and realizing that people respond to these questions in a variety of ways, still within a constrained system, so you can still do it, technically speaking, but we have to allow for that kind of thing. So I'm pretty positive about the whole thing, and I used to work on phone systems, IVRs, that a lot of people really hated, and I swore off speech for many years, and then I got back into it, and in my mind we have kind of the first and second eras of speech. The first era was IVRs, things like that, phone systems, where we learned a lot about actually how to build conversations. And then when I got my Amazon Echo, that to me was this new era. It's true you can do everything you can do on an Echo, you can do with your phone, but it's a whole different world, and I use it in such a different way. So to me, we're in this new, exciting time, and I look forward to seeing what the next conversations are.
Great.
So I want to just bring up one distinction, you know, just to guide the conversation. So there's a difference between a task-oriented conversation, where you have the CUI, the interface to something else, versus a kind of pass the time of day conversation, where the conversation itself is the only thing that's happening, and there's no action behind it or no it's just chit chat. So I think mostly when talk about an interface, a conversational interface, we're talking about an interface to some back end of some sort.
Yes, I think we should agree for our conversation. Yeah. We're talking about conversational technologies that are useful to people in some way.
It does something.
You don't get in front of a GUI just to pass the time of day.
Yeah.
Except maybe YouTube
on Twitter.
Well, I mean, that's a legitimate thing, but it's a different thing.
But yeah, let's stay on that idea that we're actually building something that's useful, which is very much in line with what you were describing, Cathy. That we may not be at the point where we have this conversational user interface in the same way that a graphical user interface is a whole new paradigm in how we interact. But we're building useful interactions. I think that's what you were saying.
Yeah.
So do you see a value in going steps beyond that into something that is more like human conversation?
I definitely do. I think one of the frustrations anyone who has something like an Amazon Echo or Google Home right now is this idea of discoverability. You've got 25,000 skills. Who the heck knows what they are, where they are? I've enabled some skills, and I can't remember the exact sequence of words to trigger them again. So there's probably a lot of useful skills out there that I will never know about. And I think the only way to get past that is this leap forward, and I don't know how many years it will take, to the point where I don't have to remember some trigger commands and I can just ask for what I want. One of the examples I really like to give, we were talking about earlier, is our Wi-Fi was down, had to reboot the router, et cetera, et cetera. I just kind of spontaneously said to my Amazon Echo, Alexa, are you working? And she came on and said, yes, everything's working fine. And I thought, that's so great. I didn't have to think, how am I going to ask this question about the Wi-Fi? I just spoke. And it was a lot easier than going over to my computer and logging into the router and all this stuff. So to me, that's this next leap forward, where we can have a system that can understand this very much wider variety of ways to ask for all these different things.
But you still have the problem of discoverability, right? Or are you saying that the system has so much available to it, you can say almost anything and it will do what you're looking for?
Yeah, I think it would guide you. So you might not know that there's a game about a specific thing, but you might be like, I want to play a game. And maybe it could then ask you some questions. What are you in the mood for? Do you like adventure games? Do you like this? Do you like that? Here's a highly rated one. And it can guide you in that. So yeah, I don't know all the games, but my system can be an assistant to help me find out what is out there.
Right. So just having that conversational mechanism that lets you do the exploration, I think is what you're saying.
Right, without like the old days of command lines, without having to know some command.
Yeah.
So I think discovery is a special case of education. So in a conversational system, the user and the system both come to the situation with different knowledge about things. So the system may know about airline flights or about movies or something that the user doesn't know about, but the user has their preferences and so forth. But it may be that the user doesn't understand some things and the system has to educate. So the user wants to watch a Tom Cruise movie or something like that. Well, and the user doesn't actually know which movie to ask about specifically. So the system has to come back and say, well, here are the Tom Cruise movies. Or another example, just to emphasize one of the things that I think we should be seeing sooner rather than later in terms of language understanding is if you say, well, I want a James Bond movie without Roger Moore.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And if you do that now, you get all the Roger Moore movies. It's just like, because without is a stop word, right, in a lot of these systems now. But I think that this kind of two-way communication, this collaboration between the system and the user, part of that is discovery, part of that is sharing information that will change actually what the user thinks that they're after in interacting with the system.
So in some of those examples, it seems like you could get at what you want, like I want a Tom Cruise movie or movies without Roger Moore with like a faceted search GUI style interaction.
So the contrast with the GUI, I've made the argument that the GUI was great, and for the things that it's really appropriate for, but it's really kind of topped out. You go to some of these web pages now, And yes, you know, there are the pop-ups and the this and all that stuff that you understand how to use those elements, but you don't know what to poke at. You're just scanning the page, looking for the login or the subscribe or the buy or the whatever it is, because the screen real estate is so, let's call it, valuable to people that they jam all this stuff into it that distracts you from what you want to do. But if you come in with your intention and you can just say, you know, I want to do such and such, you know, find the app that does it or the skill or the back-end service or whatever it is. And you don't have to do all that scanning around the page. And if you make a mistake, the other thing about conversation that we should bring out is you don't have to be perfect in what you ask for.
Right. Well, you do right now. That's the problem.
Well, I mean, in a good conversation, well, and there are, you know, systems, you know, the problem is systems that are deployed are maybe different than systems that are in the labs and so forth. But, you know, in a human-to-human conversation, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have perfect understanding, and you don't have to have perfect expression of what you want. I mean, when you're talking to your colleague, or I'm talking to my wife, you know, I understand maybe 80% of what she says, but still we muddle forward. I take out the trash when the trash is supposed to go out, and, you know, she responds the appropriate way, and maybe we make mistakes. But in a conversational system, you can say, well, wait a minute, that's not what I meant. Actually, I meant Tuesday and not Thursday, whatever it is.
So this is
in the GUI, you have the back button.
This is some future conversational
Well,
system
no, but
you're
I think that
referring
the
to, right?
technology is there. I think we're looking at the 80-20 problem also, the big head, long tail, and that there's a lot of value in asking and answering questions about the weather. Yeah. And so a lot of the deployed systems are really, really good at the big head, highly frequent capabilities.
So Abby, you mentioned that subtle interactions are still missing. Is this along those lines, or did you have something else in mind too?
If you think about just the heaviest use interactions, so if something goes wrong during these interactions, for example, playing music and then you get the wrong artist, you can't easily recover from that. You actually have to start the conversation over again. There's like, oh, I meant this, or no, I wanted to hear instrumental, you know, holiday music instead. And so what we're faced with is that every time we interact with a voice interface, it's starting over from the beginning. But in every other conversation we have with people, we don't start over from the beginning each time. We have an entire history of conversation with them, either from previous days or even from that same day or minutes earlier. And so right now we have this huge error recovery problem where what happens is the first question is, okay, did I speak too quickly? Did I speak loudly enough? You know, have those things happened? And so what I've seen in studies is people end up just speaking more loudly to the device. You know, it's like, and so that's it's something where it's like, oh, so much for all that dialogue building about how to recover from an error when people are like, actually, I meant such and such. It doesn't end up happening in the.
I have seen prototype systems. Again, the problem is kind of scaling and deploying.
And listening.
But the capability to do that does exist. One of the issues, I think, has to do, and I'm going to say something a little bit heretical, is how do we get beyond the current infatuation with machine learning and deep learning and all this stuff where you don't actually see the examples in the 20% of interactions that you like to be able to kind of code up or deal with, whereas there are kind of more knowledge-based systems that actually integrate the machine learning with things that are known about language or things that are known about conversation, don't have to be learned, that can do some of these more advanced behaviors. And the problem is, how do you scale it up? How do you deploy it? How do you argue for the value of it, you know, the actual commercial value of it, when 80% of the people are asking about weather and, you know, and traffic and, you know, and things like that, that these systems tend to do very, very well because they've seen so much data about that.
Do you think it's possible we could evolve a dialect, a tech English, that, you know, together, you know, humans together with technology start to develop, you know, like I do this in Starbucks. It's like I speak Starbucks to order a coffee. I've adapted to the language of Starbucks. I can get a cup of coffee most efficiently by just saying it the way they expect me to say it. Could this evolve in the way, these devices that we have?
Well,
I would say.
And would it be useful? Maybe not.
I would
Would
say.
it solve the problem?
I hope not. I mean, I know that there's a lot of talk about how with search engines, people have learned how to speak search engine, and rather people used to type whole sentences, and now they just type keywords. I want to go back to the whole sentences. I want this to end up being people don't learn a new tech speak. I think certainly I do. There are certainly times when I'm trying to ask my Google Home for information, and I keep rephrasing it because I'm always testing it. And so I'll start with one form of the question, and then I'll try again. And even at the dinner table, my family will be asking in different ways, and we'll play the Amazon Echo off the Google Home. But that's not what I want. I want to just turn and say in my normal way. So my hope is certainly that we be more like human and not try to build a text speak.
That's what makes it hard.
The places where it doesn't make sense to have that full conversation, or where you might say in the first place, I want to see Tom Cruise movies. Well, then the next part of it, do you want to tell it every single other thing you want to do, or should you have a multimodal interface that then suddenly shows you 18 Tom Cruise movies, and you can say, oh, none of those? Or is it going to read out 18 Tom Cruise movies to you, which is the last thing anyone wants? And so that's where I think seeing better combinations of these, and I think as we have more and more voice-based devices with screens that are available or soon to be available, that we'll get to play with more of those interactions and see if they actually work.
So yeah, I mean, as an output, this is an issue of multimodal fusion, sometimes they call it. And there's both the input side and the output side. And on the output side, you never want to get a list of 100 items, right? So, there's the magical number 7 plus or minus 2 kind of argument, and maybe it's actually -2 or maybe even -5 in some cases. So that's when you want to have a screen. You want to kind of, but you want to be able to talk about the things on the screen. You want to say, well, I want the one on the left, or the one, the second one, or whatever. You'd like to be able to describe back to the system the scene that the system has presented to you. And that's a capability, again, that I have seen, but I don't see it as widely distributed.
And also, people replace their TVs very rarely. So it's something, you get a new TV every 5 to 10 years, maybe, if you're into getting a bigger TV. And so being able to have a screen is not something that I would assume is going to happen in people's households.
Like Amazon has a screen.
Yeah, they have the
on the
Echo
Echo
Show,
now, right? Yeah.
And they have a little one which looks like an alarm clock, which is actually pretty cool looking.
Yeah. So it seems like these multimodal interactions we should expect.
And gestures, being able to say, well, one of those, if you were driving down the street in your car and you went, well, does that restaurant have any openings?
Some of this, like Ron, what you were describing, seems to me like there's some shared model you have with the technology about this space that you can both see. So I guess that constrains the problem, but that's the problem we're talking about, right? Is there's all this shared knowledge that humans have that let us do all these interactions so seamlessly and easily. It's not just that we know how to have conversation, it's that there's all this world that we know about, and we know what each other know.
And we know a lot about the context. So, one of the big issues in all these systems is ambiguity. Most of what's understood in ordinary human conversation is not actually said. But an example, this is one of my favorite old examples, which is a linguistic ambiguity that is not ambiguous in context. So if the question is the chicken ready to eat? That's ambiguous. In a barnyard, it has one meaning. In a kitchen, it has another meaning. And you don't have to say, well, in the conversational interaction, you don't have to tediously pin it down. You don't have to have the system say, well, did you mean cooked or did you mean hungry? Because it's just obvious. It's just known.
If we constrain the domain to something doesn't that eliminate lots of the ambiguity? And it doesn't seem like that's worked, actually, though.
The context can, eliminates a lot of ambiguity, and a lot of ambiguity maybe doesn't even matter. And the system, if it recognizes that it matters, then it should ask.
Yeah, I think one of the things I think about with context awareness, actually, and just a side note about chickens, I was reading this interesting article about some speech recognition for chickens where farmers were using it to determine what kind of chicken distress call or something, like certain distress calls for a hawk is above, and so they could go back and listen to what happened the previous evening, and the computer would tell them the events of the chickens, which I thought was a joke, but it was in Scientific American, so I think it was really true. But thinking about context awareness, one that I really like is with Cortana. If you are driving and you have your if you have a Bluetooth earpiece and you're driving in the car and you get a text message, it does something a little bit differently. It says, you have a text message from Cathy Pearl. Do you want to hear it? Because it knows probably you're driving. It doesn't really know for 100% sure, but it uses enough context clues that it's got a good idea. And it changes its behavior slightly based on that versus if you're holding the phone in your hand. And I think that's a really important way that we can take advantage of context and do the right thing conversationally based on what your needs are with a few clues.
Do any of you see evidence of things today that are actually implemented today that you think are indicators of this future state where we have rich, natural conversations? Is there anything to make us think it's on the horizon?
We talked about Eliza before. So we talked about how we were just like, oh, well, real conversation where you have this chat with somebody else is not this, it's not the same as their Internet of Things task-oriented conversation that we're having. But most of the conversations we have, like 60% of our speech is about us, telling people things about ourselves, which is amazing. And so it's something where it's like, I think in the end, the most satisfying, most used, most conversational interfaces are going to be these ones that are more personal. And I don't think we're very far away from that. And you can see it already in some chatbots, not Wobot apparently, because our needs are in some ways not that deep. It's really that we need somebody to listen to us. And these interfaces can seem to provide that.
Yeah, I was just talking to somebody about GUIs, which is the Microsoft chatbot that gets a lot of use. People will talk to it apparently 20 minutes at a time. And someone was telling me that one of the big use cases is kids complaining about their parents. And I was thinking, because I'm thinking, what am I going to spend 20 minutes talking to a chatbot about? But I love this idea of a safe space. It reminds me of another quote I heard from the CEO of Affectiva. They do emotion detection technology, and she was saying how she imagines a world where her daughter grows up with a virtual assistant, and by the time the daughter is 30, the virtual assistant will know her better than her own parents do. And thinking about the good and the bad of that, like there's this positive thing about knowing that there's this supportive companion out there all the time that you can vent to, you can talk to. Maybe they can nudge you when you need some help remembering to do certain things. How, it's really positive. But then there's this whole negative side too, like, oh my gosh, am I just going to never talk to anyone ever again? Because are we going to be like in that Isaac Asimov story, everybody lives in a separate house and it's like disgusting to go close to a human being because you're so used to talking to your personalized, perfect, interactive bot. I mean, maybe I already don't like calling people on the phone. Am I going to send my bot to give a message to somebody else's bot, like, about something? So I think we could go in kind of different directions with that, but it could be that we end up with these very personal bots who we just talk to about ourselves.
So we were talking about task-based interactions in particular. Are there like Eliza-like interactions that could help make those better?
Make what better?
Make the task, task-based, collaborative.
I mean, that's certainly.
Where you're trying to achieve something. The technology and the person are working together.
Right.
So now we've brought up this idea of kind of chit-chat. So are there things that happen in chit-chat that actually improve those task-based?
Certainly at Sensely, we have some, I wouldn't go quite as far as say real chit-chat, but questions that aren't required. Like, is there anything else you'd like to share with me? And some people tend to open up a little bit there. And we can use some of that information as even particularly part of their health. Maybe we're saying, you've sounded kind of stressed lately. We're going to let your doctor know they might want to give you a call. So
is that post hoc or the dialogue system itself
It's
can
it's
react.
both. We do some of both. Sometimes we just say we'll pass that along to your doctor, and sometimes we actually are analyzing it for sentiment and are branching differently on it. So I think there is an element of chit-chat that can serve a task-based conversation if you do it carefully and wisely.
Abby, what do you think about this idea of a Eliza-like addition to useful conversations?
It might end up being that we don't have necessary conversations with actual people we care about, or that we might be avoiding difficult conversations by having them with a chatbot instead. But at the same time, it's something where we'd have to figure out, like, is there human value to it? And do people, and human value in the sense of, do people enjoy it? Does it help their day? Are they more positive after using it? Or, and I don't know for sure, like, are people actually more negative after speaking with a robot that's not really understanding every single thing?
So there's at least a user experience quality.
But when I think about my thermostat, I don't want to tell it my feelings. And that's pretty much true with all the devices in my home. But at the same time, I would really like for my home to welcome me back when I get home each day, and not necessarily by playing, Eye of the Tiger, but I think there's something to be said for that, being greeted, being acknowledged, and showing interest in someone.
There's a very primitive notion of the system understanding me in a conversational sense that has to do with preferences and recommendations. So typically now recommendation systems watch what you do, watch which movies you do, or watch what you order, whatever it is, and they map you onto other people that have done similar things, and they make recommendations. Mm-hmm. But you can actually talk about the things that you like and don't like in systems that I've seen. So you can say, in the movie domain, I don't like Meg Ryan, and create a preference that maybe it's viable if the only movies that are on are Meg Ryan, but the last thing that it should show you is Meg Ryan if there's anything else that's available, no matter what else you say. So that's kind of creating a standing preference by talking about it. And to the extent that it doesn't offer you Meg Ryan movies, you have the feeling that maybe it understood you. Or I'm allergic to nuts, let's say. So it understands you that to mean, don't ever show me snacks with nuts. Mm-hmm. I don't have to talk about that anymore because I've created a preference. I've personalized it through the conversation, which is a very special primitive case of it understands me and my feelings and all that kind of stuff. But those kinds of things are possible with systems that I've seen, today.
One of the ones that comes to mind is another chatbot called Replica, which is supposed to learn about you over time. And in the beginning, it asked you lots of questions, like it asked me what I was reading, and I said, one of my favorite books was Version Control by Dexter Palmer, which is about physics and online dating and time travel, if you're into that kind of thing. And then,
combo.
like 2 weeks later, Replica said to me, I remember you said you really liked that book, Version Control. And it's true, it's very scripted and primitive and whatever, but it was kind of cool. It's like, yeah, we were talking about that. And another thing it did was it brought up a photo from my Instagram feed. You can give it permission, it asks you permission. And it brought up a picture in my Instagram feed and said, who's this? And it was me, actually. But it's...
So it makes it sound dumb, though, doesn't it? Or,
well, I was in a Halloween costume.
You?
I was dressed up as a replicant, actually, from Blade Runner. But it was like, I just thought it's one of the, both Woebot and Replica have given me these brief moments of feeling like, we're getting somewhere. Uh-huh. Like, this is a conversational thing. Yes, it's still got a long ways to go. But I've had flashes of moments where I thought, wow, this is cool. I can see where this is going. I feel like it's evolving.
Is there a dark side to this, too? Is there a future Black Mirror episode? Or there could be?
Yeah, I mean, there's always
I think you hinted at it a little bit
with something that maybe takes you away from interacting with other humans. There was a stat that came out recently that said that people, when they're using an Echo or a Home, report that they're using it with someone else about half the time. So to me, that's a real standout about
But that Xiao voice, That's the opposite, right?
Right, and right. So they're sort of almost different contexts. So when I'm at home with my family or I've got friends over, we all know when we ask the Echo a question and we all hear the response. So it becomes a joint thing, or we play a game together with the Echo. Whereas Showwise, although Showwise actually jumps into people's group chats. Like if you're talking about cats, it'll jump in and say, here's a cute picture of a cat. So it inserts itself into conversations as well. So there's room for group engagement too, I think.
I assume that's well received. It's very popular.
I assume not.
Yeah, you don't think so.
It depends on how cute the cat
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
So thinking about these tuning via conversation, right? And so that's what you're doing, is you're sort of tuning your interactions.
By talking about yourself?
By talking about yourself. So you get to tell things about yourself, but at the same time, think about how long it takes you to learn about another human being, and when are you going to do all of this? And so there's the example of maybe you start when you're a little kid and you train it. You don't get to reinvent yourself in college. You're the same to your agent for your entire life, right? And so there's something unfortunate about that.
Why can't you just say,
Erase
I'm now in college.
Delete everything.
Yeah,
Start over.
remember what I told you when I was 5?
Forget it. Then you really regret it.
That's true. Well, I mean, that happens with recommendation systems now, right? Like if I buy something for my mother-in-law, then Amazon's telling me forever I want that.
Well, and with implicit learning, so one thing we learned when we first got a smart thermostat was we like to turn up the heat when it's cold, and our thermostat was like, oh, you like to turn the heat on, all right. And it went against everything my husband and I know, which is like, hey, put on a sweater first, make sure you're wearing socks, And instead it learned our bad habits from us. And it's like, oh, one $300 heating bill later, here, in Menlo Park, it was like, oh no, we have made a horrible mistake, and we need to make sure we
There's your Black Mirror episode right
put
there.
in programming. It was like, oh yeah, we're just
Does
turning the
whatever
heat up
we
every
want.
night. So it's that it's. I would worry about something learning all my bad habits, or never showing me something objectionable again because I said, you know what, I don't want to see another school shooting on the news. What happens then when you isolate yourself so much from everything else happening in the world?
This is kind of true of our world today, right? We get these very narrow views of life. But is it possible through conversation that could actually be corrected? Like if my personal assistant has the wrong idea of me, could I explain, no, you've got it wrong now, and maybe that could improve this situation we're heading towards anyway.
Or if you told it, like, maybe your personal goal is to not use up a lot of heat, and so your thermometer's like, I noticed you've been turning the heat on a lot at 8 p.m. I just suggest 1 degree cooler. Or if you ask it to help you behave better. But then I was reading about in CES, I guess there's this someone's brought out a new fridge that was going to tell you what meals to eat to be healthy and all this stuff, and it would know what meals you took out of the fridge. Is it going to report to your doctor that Cathy's not following her meal plan that you put her on? I mean, that's where to me it gets kind of a little dicey.
But I think your example, there's actually a higher order intention that you have. You want to be warm, but the actual mechanism for your warmth is a subsidiary thing. In fact, you have 2 different things. You want to be warm and you want to save the planet. So you like, if the device has a thermometer and it recognizes it doesn't get cold, you like it before you start freezing to tell you, well, put on your socks, maybe. And then if that doesn't work, then
So your thermostat tells you no when you say, I want it warm.
No. Yeah, not the thermostat.
I'm sorry, I can't do that.
The thermostat.
But it really was the paperclip problem, where it was optimizing. It was like, oh, I just learned that you like to turn the heat up, and you turn the heat up 5 days in a row, so it's time to keep doing it.
But you were doing that for a higher order kind of thing. And that goes to another thing about this notion of a universal interface that kind of stays the same roughly across devices. So, English doesn't change when you're talking at Starbucks or whatever it is. You talk about different things, and you maybe have fragments, and there's more context. But basically, the patterns of the language and the patterns of conversation are relatively stable. So what I think is an interesting next challenge, and I know people are working on this, is using the conversational interface to combine two different subtasks into a single higher order task. So a classical challenge of this is the romantic evening, which is a romantic dinner with followed by a romantic movie. So you gotta have the conversation about the dinner, you go to Open Table and all that kind of stuff. You gotta have the conversation about the movie, you go to Fandango and do all that kind of stuff. But there's actually coordination between them, the time and the place and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of a higher order intention, which is the planning the evening, which then kind of devolves into these two separate sub-conversations that have to be reintegrated. And I think that's sort of a challenge. And that's when these things are going to be really, for me, much more useful.
Sounds like learning by instruction, where you can compose different primitive skills into.
Well, I mean, that's the kind of, that's another riff on, learning by instruction versus learning by observations, machine learning versus knowledge and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean.
But we could train our conversational agents.
There's planning that goes in there. There's kind of knowledge representation, spatial constraints, temporal constraints, there's traffic, all sorts of stuff that has to be integrated. And I think that's sort of a driving kind of problem. I mean, in the sense of motivation, not the sense of.
I think we should open it up now and see if anyone has any questions. We've got microphones. So wait till you get your microphone so the recording gets your question loud and clear.
I'm paranoid about Alexa and Siri, and I turn off Siri on my iPhone, and I'm very uncomfortable with friends who have Alexa and leave it on, and I actually ask them on occasion to turn it off. And I think that there are huge privacy issues that I'd be interested in hearing what the panel has to say about it. For example, the Black Mirror episode is that an intelligent agent blackmails somebody because of conversations overheard in the house. And the agents are getting smart enough, despite the law of robotics, to do stuff. So I think down the road, if not at the present, this raises tremendous ethical, profound ethical questions.
Yeah,
and I'd be interested in what you have to say.
You were starting to bring that up at one point.
Yeah, well, I think anyone who has a phone with a microphone and camera, or a laptop or desktop computer with a microphone and camera, should be concerned about their security and privacy. It's not just about Alexa or Google Home.
But
Those
even if you
things
have a
can all
keyboard,
be-
you have to be concerned if you're really going to be concerned.
Well, in terms of microphones that can be turned on without you knowing about it, it's like if you're really worried about it, then there's a lot to be worried about, definitely. And I think it's also important to have it be really clear and really easy to be able to turn things off and be able to stop them when we don't want to have them. And it'll be interesting to see if when we invite people into our homes, if we alert them in advance and say, hey, it's just FYI, Alexa's here, I can turn it off if you want.
Yeah, we got one at work, and one of my coworkers was like, "Oh no, we're not turning that on." But we had an Amazon Echo. But now he's a big fan of playing Jeopardy with it. So, but as somebody who's worked in this space for a very long time, although I'm very concerned about privacy in many areas of my life, I don't spend a lot of time worrying about the privacy with my devices like my phone and my Echo in my home. And I think it's mostly because I think it's true they're susceptible, potentially, possibly in the future, to hacking. But I think they're designed, and that the way these companies are operating are in as ethical a ways as they can, which is they make it very, very clear that when it's listening. So right now, I think I did see one article where somebody physically was able to take an Amazon and physically hack it to be able to listen without the light. But currently, I don't think there's any other way to do it. So you always know when it's listening. So even if it accidentally hears the wake word and you didn't really say the wake word, you will see the light come on. It anonymizes, and of course, it doesn't there's nothing going to the cloud up until that point, up until the point where the light turns on. So the wake word is processed locally. It's not sent off to the cloud. So anything you're saying in your house is not sent off to Amazon or Google. It does stream once it's recognized the wake word, but they anonymize that data. They don't keep that data. You can also go in and see what they've heard, and you can delete it yourself. So if you're comfortable having a phone, then you should be comfortable having one of these devices, like Abby's saying. If you're really paranoid, sure. Throw out your phone, turn off all your microphones, put tape over your cameras, because probably there will come a time, maybe when something can be hacked, but in terms of how it's designed to not share your data around and spread your data.
We should go to another question. Vince Spector.
So I agree there's a distinction between task-directed or task-oriented and non-task-oriented conversations. I take issue with calling one useful and by implication the other one useless. At Alexa, we get a lot of conversations that are so-called phatic, which are just people chatting with Alexa.
Yep.
And then in a more useful setting, Cathy, you talked about older people. Loneliness is the #1 health problem that older people face, because it leads to all kinds of additional health problems. And so having something you can chat with would be extremely useful. Wobot is another example of something which is not an interface to something. It is the thing you want to chat with. So I think as AIs get more intelligent and more companionable, talking to them will have a purpose in addition to serving as an interface to something else. There's a lot of lessons one can learn from one type of conversation that will apply to the other type, both in terms of conversational experience, design, as well as the underlying technologies that go into making these kinds of conversations possible. So I think we would do ourselves a service to look at both types of conversations instead of focusing just on one or the other.
That's a good point.
So it seems to me that the privacy issue, it has an inherent conflict with the desire to have continuous conversation, because people who've been in the industry know that continuous conversation, that is having an ongoing conversation without using a wake word every time you want to say the next thing, it is possible, it has been in the industry for a while, but it's being intentionally locked down so that it's not always listening. And so where's the balance for that? So the example I have in my life with Alexa is I often find myself with the anthropomorphization is saying thank you, and then I get taken aback when she doesn't say you're welcome. Well, that's because I didn't say, Alexa, thank you. So where's the balance there?
I mean, one of the things I've noticed with the Echo is you have to say the wake word, but there are times when it'll still leave a listening on for a brief period. So if you're in the quote, middle of a conversation, it will continue to listen, and then if it still doesn't hear anything, it'll shut off. So like the thank you, maybe it could extend the listening just slightly in case someone says thank you. So that might be one way to balance, where once you've initiated a conversation, it can stay listening for a little bit.
I think that gets to the conversational norms that we expect. And you don't necessarily want it listening all the time, but once you, as Cathy said, once you've started a conversation, there's some expectation about how that conversation should go, and we ought to be able to accommodate that.
In a human situation, I mean, that could also happen in a human situation if there's somebody in the room that you haven't noticed, or who's hiding, or in the closet or whatever. Yes, but in a normal setting, you know who's there, and you don't say certain things in front of that person or the other. And it would be silly or not silly, I shouldn't say silly, but it would be surprising if someone would sneak in through your front door and hide in your room and listen. They should make themselves known, and I think the same way, if you trust these companies that are kind of creating these things, then you could have a situation where, yeah, it's a continuous conversation, but it makes itself known every 10 seconds or 20 seconds. It breathes heavily, or it burps, or it does something that a human might do to make you. It says ahem, or whatever.
Well, that's where the accessibility feature on Alexa is really nice, where you can have it, also give you a chime when it is listening to you, or when it's heard. Sorry, when it's heard you, and so that So you know things are happening there. You know that the wake word is actually heard and everything. And so I think, while that's not the answer to your question, right, is to have a light and have a chime. At the same time, we get those indications from other people, or we get, the idea of attention and awareness. And so then the question is, how do we do that with a device, and how do we get that from a device?
Dan Espenson, Touch Technologies. We've been working with the Alexa since it first came out, and developed, I think, the 15th skill or something like that. But one of the things that happens, people think they take turns in conversations, but you don't. You say, Alexa, blah, blah, blah. She starts on the wrong path, and you go, no, what I mean is, and of course there's no listening happening until the very end of the no, I mean thing, and now you're going on, and you're out of sync now with the conversation. Have you seen solutions to those things, since you guys all studied that? I mean, just in general, not with Alexa, but just in general.
Again, there's systems, so barge in. But all these things have to partly with scaling, the actual cost effectiveness, and if it's listening, when it's doing something, when it's saying something, it's listening. It has to always be kind of going back and forth. And I'm not talking about Alexa. I'm not speaking for Amazon here. I was recently at Amazon, so nothing I said here has anything to do with Amazon. Barge in and Alexa and Google Home, they're not really conversational in the sense that we're talking about. And partly is the wake-up word thing, which is controlling the thing. But even without the wake-up word thing, sometimes they get into little conversational loops with specific skills or apps or whatever. But they're not really conversation in the sense that we would like, and that we've been trying to talk about here. And I think that's coming. There's a lot of computer science problems in terms of communication back and forth in the cloud and all that.
In my group, we did create a conversational user interface for copy machines. And we did it in a way that left the microphone open. So I think these are design and business choices that people are making right now with the devices that they put on the market. And for us, it was possible because we had this very narrow task of, I say narrow, but there's like 42 different options you could pick. But it was constrained enough that it was okay to leave it, to accept all the input and ignore the things that weren't relevant.
I just have one real quick other one. And how have you seen things deal with oronyms? Ice cream and ice cream.
Well, if it's in a restricted, thinking about at my company, so there's a lot of common things that are like, we have one example where they say, people can ask a question about how do I adjust the injection depth on my device? And it often misrecognizes injection depth. But we know that. So because we know of those types of things, we can handle it anyway without the user even really realizing that there was a misrecognition. But I was going to say, to your earlier point, a lot of the problems I see in a lot of voice skills and on chatbots is poor turn-taking indicators. I see this all the time with a skill where it says a question, and then you start to talk, and then it asks and then some more information, and it's just like, wait, what? So making very, very explicit turn-taking rules, like ask a question and then don't keep talking, are ways to try and alleviate some of the problems we have right now where we can't easily move back and forth and we have to wait and take turns. Just make it more clear.
And the timing is very, very important, in terms of interruptions and things. If you can't do it, then it's a disaster.
We'll take two more questions.
This question is kind of backing up a little bit in the premise of this panel discussion. Going to the issue of so what is human language versus written language versus spoken language? I'm a little bit seeing perhaps a confounding of issues here in terms of with the progress in what I might consider to be really nifty speech-to-text and text-to-speech devices, we're sort of being a little bit, we're getting ear candy thrown at us, and whereas the understanding problem still lurks and is still unsolved. So is there? I'm trying to. I don't know if I can sharpen this to a particular question, but. Is spoken language all of language? And And where is understanding of human language in general, however it's represented?
Do you mean what's the state of the art now for understanding
Well, I think the
natural
Odyssey
language?
would tell us that, yes, human language can be captured in spoken language, but it has special features to it and specifics to it that are different than written language. Thinking about spoken language, one of the big differences between oral tradition and written is that in oral, we repeat ourselves a lot. And if you look at his poems, like the Odyssey, there's a lot of repetition, and that's to help the speaker remember what they're going to say. Whereas once you transfer over to a written language in a society, suddenly you don't have that same repetition because you don't have to remember it because it's all written down. And so language is really different between speech and between what's written down. It doesn't necessarily mean that what we say is not valuable, it's just different.
I have a question. I was wondering, with all the Internet of Things and the interconnectedness and the skills that are out there, and yet they're developing products with personality and even the evolution into robotics. Do you see, with the market share and the access to data that Google and Amazon Echo have, how these smaller companies and areas that are specific, healthcare or something, how they all interrelate? Like if you create a personality for like a robot here, and you say, Alexa, can I talk to Maybu, or Maybu, can I talk to Alexa? Like the different personality. How is that all going to work out over time? Do you see that evolving?
The simple answer is, well, I don't.
Do you,
I
Molly
mean,
must have a
the ecosystem is
personality,
very
right? You
complicated
must have
now.
designed a personality for Molly?
Sure, yeah, and we have different avatars. We don't just have Molly, but I don't know what the answer to this is, but I can imagine that, like, maybe my fridge has, quote, some intelligence, but I'm not gonna, if I wanna order something, I don't wanna have to go talk to my fridge. I probably wanna say to one thing, like, hey, I need more milk, and let the sort of main listener decide who to, put that out to. So I don't have to remember that maybe I've got 20 assistants in my house, one in the stove, one in the fridge, one in the, each room in my house. I would like to have a more like an overarching assistant who would delegate, and I can just say the thing. So perhaps we will have these individual assistants who will communicate with each other. Perhaps on special cases I communicate with each one individually, but in general I don't want to have to remember each one.
But do you think that open interface is the way to go, though? I mean, have a standalone won't work in that the way we're evolving also.
Well, so there's the front-end interface, which is the conversational interface, which is maybe Google Home or Alexa or whatever it is. But if you're talking about what is the API, the back-end APIs to all the different services and so forth, I mean that's a different computer science problem. How does OpenTable, for example, export its ontology so that it maps onto the ordinary language ontology that a user might use to talk about food, or to talk about animals, or to talk about whatever it is. So, I think separating those aspects of it and thinking about the conversational interface as a mapping and a dispatch in terms of choosing which service to go to or what database or whatever it is, and then doing a translation from the way you think about things and express things into whatever the back end wants for that particular service. There has to be some uniformity there, otherwise it's everything, everybody has to do everything. But so there has to be protocols for exporting information back and forth. And I think that's a hard try. Viv Labs, that was one of the things that they were working on before they were bought by Samsung. They talked about.
I think there are also very specific legal and regulatory requirements around things like health data. So you're going to have, there's going to be a requirement of some specialty, at least in areas where you have these very specific regulations where other companies aren't going there. And so I think I can see where with Cathy's company it makes a lot of sense. Like, oh yeah, of course you would do that, because just think about the current communication requirements when it comes to things like electronic health records and which companies are approaching that and which ones aren't.